Have you ever wondered about the things we were never meant to see? Pieces of media, once created and released to the world, only to disappear, vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but whispers, rumours, and speculation. What happens to a piece of content when it slips through the cracks of time? Was it simply forgotten, or was it hidden away deliberately? In this series, we're diving deep into the darker side of lost media, the stories that haunt the internet, the mysteries that have evaded even the most determined investigators, and the content so unsettling that it's almost as if someone, somewhere, never wanted us to find it. Welcome to the dark side of lost media. It's the 1970s in Australia, an era of big hair, colourful outfits, and TV game shows that glued families to their living rooms. Among them was Great Temptation, a show that quickly became a household favourite. Hosted by the charming Tony Barber, with his quick smile and effortless charisma, and co-hosted by the lively Barbara Rogers, the show was a hit. It was all about high energy, big prizes, and a dash of drama. But what if, behind the bright lights and cheerful applause, there was a secret, a dark and tragic moment never meant to be seen? Great Temptation was a game show that kept Australian audiences hooked. Contestants answered rapid-fire trivia questions, earning cash with every correct answer. But the real twist came when the top player had the chance to trade their points for a prize, something valuable they'd get to keep no matter what. It was a risky move, though. Spending those points could mean the difference between winning or losing the game. For a while, everything seemed to be going smoothly. The show was a hit, and fans tuned in each week to watch contestants battle it out. But then, something changed. There was an episode that never aired, a gap in the lineup that fans couldn't ignore, a recording that was locked away and never spoken about on air. The lights were up, the cameras were rolling, and Tony Barber was in his element, cracking jokes, firing off questions, and keeping the energy high. Contestants were battling it out, and for the audience, it was business as usual. But then, something happened. Something that no one in the studio expected. According to Tony Barber, the contestant, Valerie, had just won the game, a moment that should have been full of celebration. Tony had announced, "Congratulations, Valerie, you've won." But instead of cheers, there was confusion. Valerie slumped forward, her body going limp. She lay there, motionless. At first, nobody was sure what was happening. The applause died down, and uncertainty settled over the set. The production crew acted quickly, halting the taping and clearing the studio while doctors were called. The lively atmosphere was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Tony Barber retreated to his dressing room, waiting anxiously for news. When the floor manager finally arrived, Tony asked, "How is she? She seems to have passed out." The response was chilling. "Tony? She's passed on." The reality of the situation hit hard, and what had started as a routine episode had suddenly become a tragic and unforgettable moment, all captured and recorded. Then, in the middle of the shock, someone said, "I suppose we'll have to do this episode again?" A comment that felt cold and out of place, like the loss didn't really matter. The episode was never aired. The footage was tucked away, out of sight, leaving those who were there to piece together what had happened and grapple with an incident that would forever remain part of TV's hidden history. After Valerie's sudden collapse, taping stopped immediately. The episode was never finished and never aired. No one knows what really happened to her or how much she had won that day. It was like all the details just disappeared, and no one seemed eager to dig deeper. There's not much to go on about that lost episode. No clear record of when it was taped, and considering it happened in the early 70s, a time when tapes were often reused, it's unlikely the footage still exists. Chances are it's been erased, leaving behind only questions. What's even stranger is how little information there is about Valerie. There's almost nothing, no mention of a last name, no detailed reports. It's as if her story was quietly brushed aside, never meant to be remembered. It makes the comment of someone mentioning having to record the episode again feel so unsettling. It's like her death was just another inconvenience, something to move past. The show went on with new contestants, more winners, and countless episodes. But for those who knew, there was always that one episode, a strange gap that nobody wanted to talk about. It was the early hours of Friday, May 21st, 2010, in Bradford, West Yorkshire, England. The city was still, its streets deserted, while the world slept. But inside a rundown block of flats, something was happening. Something that would never be forgotten. A CCTV camera blinked in the dimly lit corridor, silently recording everything in its view. The footage, however, would remain hidden from the public, locked away, never to be seen. The man captured on the CCTV camera was Stephen Griffiths, and with him a woman named Suzanne Blaemyers. To understand what exactly that camera recorded, we need to go back to Stephen's story, and how it all led to this moment. Stephen Griffiths was born in 1969 in West Yorkshire, an unremarkable boy growing up in a quiet suburb. His early life was largely uneventful. By all outward appearances, he was simply another child in a working-class family. But those who knew him well often described something a little off about him, a certain distance in his manner that set him apart. He wasn't the type to blend in. As he entered adolescence, that strange distance grew wider. He became fascinated by stories of violence and those whose names had been etched into the darker side of history. At 17, this fascination turned into action. He was arrested for attacking a supermarket manager with a knife, an impulsive act of violence that caught everyone by surprise. The boy they thought was just a little odd was suddenly a danger. This incident landed him in a young offenders institution. Authorities hoped confinement would steer him back on course, but Stephen wasn't like the other troubled youths. Rehabilitation didn't reach him. After his release, Stephen returned to a quieter life, pursuing a degree in criminal justice at the University of Bradford. But those close to him noticed a change. He was growing more isolated, more absorbed in the grim subjects that seemed to consume him. It was a subtle shift, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. Then, in the summer of 2009, something happened. Susan Rushworth, a 43-year-old mother of 3, disappeared. She had spent years struggling with addiction following a brain hemorrhage that caused epilepsy. Though her life had been difficult, Susan was starting to change things. In the days before her disappearance, she was cutting down on her substance abuse and living with her mother, Christine. On June 22nd, she told Christine she was going out to buy medicine. That was the last time anyone would see her alive. The last known image of Susan came from CCTV footage, showing her getting off a bus. From there, the details of what happened remain a mystery. At some point, Susan ended up in the flat of Stephen Griffiths. It was there that he took her life with a crossbow. He tore apart at her body in his bathtub, even going so far as to consume pieces of it. There are no remains, no physical evidence that tells the full story, just a few traces of her blood left behind in Griffith's apartment. That was all that was found of Susan Rushworth. Nearly a year passed, and then, on April 26, 2010, another woman went missing. Shelley Armitage, a 31-year-old former student with dreams of becoming a model. Like Susan, Shelley had also fallen into addiction and adult work. Concern grew quickly when she missed a court session and wasn't using her phone. Shelley, too, ended up in Griffiths' flat. Like before, he used his crossbow to take her life. But this time, Griffiths decided to capture every detail. He set up his mobile phone and began recording everything. As he dissected her body, he narrated the entire process, describing his actions in disturbing detail. It's reported that he consumed some of her body too. Parts of her remains would later be found in the River Aire in Shipley, near Bradford. After the attack, Griffiths lost his phone on a train. For weeks, it changed hands, passed between people who unknowingly held evidence of these crimes. Eventually, the phone ended up with the police, but not before some of its contents had been viewed by others. Those who saw the footage described it as something they'd never forget. Just a few months later, on May 21st, 2010, another woman disappeared. Suzanne Blamires, a 36-year-old woman who had also endured her own struggles. A violent assault the previous year had left her scarred, and like the others, she fought to survive in a world that seemed determined to pull her down. Stephen Griffiths used a familiar tactic to lure Suzanne to his flat. He played the part of a photographer, offering money for simple portraits, something he'd done before. Once inside, the atmosphere shifted. Suzanne must have sensed it. Mere minutes after entering his apartment, she fled, running down the narrow hallway of his building, with Griffiths chasing her. What happened next was captured on CCTV. Suzanne didn't get far before Griffiths caught up to her. In a sudden, violent moment, he fired a crossbow bolt into her head. With little effort, he began dragging her back toward his flat. It wasn't until then that he noticed the camera overhead, silently recording every move. He paused, stared directly at the lens, and raised his middle finger. Inside his flat, he followed the same grim pattern he'd established with his previous victims, disposing of her body in the River Aire shortly after. Some of her remains surfaced days later, but the details of what happened in that apartment stayed locked behind its walls. Just an hour later, Griffiths was out again, searching. He crossed paths with Rosalind Edmondson, a 28-year-old who was on her way to pick up methadone. They spoke briefly, and she agreed to walk back to his flat with him. Another CCTV camera caught them outside the building's entrance. But something made Rosalind hesitate. She pulled away, choosing to leave instead, unaware of just how close she had come to joining the others. Griffiths watched her leave and didn't try to stop her. 3 days after Suzanne Blamires' death, on May 24th, 2010, Peter G., the caretaker of the complex, sat down to review the CCTV footage. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Though he never shared the exact details, he was clear about one thing: the contents were beyond anything he could have imagined. Shaken and horrified, he contacted the police immediately. Stephen Griffiths was arrested shortly after, offering no resistance. In his first court appearance, he gave a name for himself: the Crossbow Cannibal. His confession was blunt and unapologetic, and in December of that same year, he stood in Leeds Crown Court. There was no trial. Griffiths pleaded guilty, and Mr. Justice Openshaw sentenced him to life imprisonment with a whole life order, no possibility of parole. Griffiths would never leave prison. Parts of the CCTV footage were eventually shown on news broadcasts, but only fragments. The segments that aired revealed a glimpse of the horror: Griffiths flipping off the camera, trying to lure another potential victim inside. Yet, the most graphic moments, the crossbow shot, the dragging of Suzanne's body, were kept from the public. The tapes, while recovered, remain locked away, their contents too disturbing to fully share. The other recordings Griffiths made, including photos of his victims and videos inside his flat, were never shown. The phone he used to document his crimes is sealed away, and it's unlikely those images will ever be seen. The full story remains out of reach, sealed away in evidence files. It's a chapter that may never be fully opened, But perhaps that's where it belongs, away from public view, left to fade like so many other dark corners of disturbing lost media. April 16th, 2007 began like any other day at Virginia Tech. Students were making their way across the campus, heading to early morning classes. Some were grabbing breakfast, while others were catching up with friends before starting their day. The sky was clear and the air was calm. It was just another Monday. Among the thousands of students going about their day was Seung-Hui Cho. To most people, he was just another quiet face on campus, someone you'd pass without a second thought. But behind that silence was a young man who had always struggled to fit in. Cho was born in South Korea and moved to the US with his family when he was just a child. They settled in Centerville, Virginia, where his parents worked hard, running a small dry cleaning business, hoping to build a better life. But while his family found a community, Cho didn't. He was quiet, withdrawn, and from an early age, something seemed off. Cho rarely spoke. He preferred to fade into the background, unnoticed by those around him. In school, he was bullied for his silence, for his strange mannerisms, and for his refusal to engage. Even when his parents sought help, through therapy, medication, and their church, nothing seemed to reach him. The isolation only deepened. By the time he got to Virginia Tech, Cho had become a ghost. He barely spoke to his roommates, kept to himself, and spent most of his time alone. Those who knew him described strange, unsettling behavior, like the time he sat silently at a party, repeatedly stabbing the carpet with a knife. Or the way he talked about an imaginary girlfriend named Jelly, a bizarre fantasy he sometimes mentioned in passing. Most people didn't pay attention to these moments. To them, Cho was just a quiet, troubled student. A little strange, maybe, but nothing more. They couldn't see what was festering beneath the surface, the isolation, the resentment, and the growing darkness inside him. And so, Cho purchased a Glock 19 pistol, as well as a Walther P22 pistol. You see, Cho had previously been diagnosed with selective mutism and severe depression. He had even received therapy and special education support during his middle school and high school years. But due to federal privacy laws, the university wasn't aware of his previous diagnoses. However, after an internal investigation following an accusation of him stalking 2 female students, a Virginia special justice declared Cho as mentally ill, ordering him to attend special treatment. Because he wasn't institutionalized, however, he was allowed to purchase the weapons. Around 7:15 a.m., Seung-Hui Cho entered West Ambler Johnston Hall, a co-ed residence building. It wasn't unusual for Cho to be there. His student mailbox was located in the lobby. But on this particular morning, Cho had something far darker on his mind. He made his way to the room of Emily Hilscher, a freshman, and without warning, shot her. A resident assistant, Ryan Clark, rushed in to help after hearing the gunfire. But before he could do anything, Cho shot him too. Cho then calmly left the building and returned to his own dorm to change out of his blood-stained clothes. At 9:40 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the first incident, Cho made his way into Norris Hall, an academic building across campus. In his backpack, he carried chains, locks, 2 handguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Once inside, he used the chains to lock the main entrance doors. He even left a note on one of the doors, warning that anyone who tried to open it would trigger an explosive. Classes were in session. Students and professors had no idea what was about to happen. Cho started on the second floor. He entered room 206, where Professor G.V. Loganathan was teaching. Without warning, Cho opened fire, taking the lives of the professor and several other students in the room. The gunfire echoed through the halls, but it was only the beginning. Cho moved from room to room, attacking anyone in his path. In room 207, He took the lives of Professor Jamie Bishop and other students who had been attending an introductory German class. In another classroom, students and a professor managed to barricade the door with desks and tables, holding off the attack for a few precious minutes. Some students tried to flee. Others jumped out of windows, desperate to escape. But for those still inside, there was no way out. And in room 211, as the sounds of gunshots drew closer, one student, Colin Goddard, reached for his phone. What followed would become one of the most chilling pieces of lost media, the 911 call from inside the classroom. Goddard tried to stay calm as he informed the dispatcher that there was a shooter in the building. In the background, the sounds of students moving frantically could be heard. Those inside were attempting to barricade the door with whatever they could find. The room had no lock. Professor Jocelyn Couture-Nowak and Henry Lee were leading the effort, but they had little time. Moments later, gunshots rang out. Cho had started shooting through the door. Goddard, still on the line, took cover under his desk. He saw the figure of Cho as he entered the room, but soon fell silent as the gunman began firing at students. The dispatcher asked if Goddard was okay, but there was no response. The gunfire continued as Cho aimed for Professor Couture-Nowak and Henry Lee before turning his attention to the rest of the room. Another student, Matthew Laporte, made a desperate attempt to tackle Cho but was gunned down in the process. The 911 call captured the chaos, the shots, the screams, and the desperate attempts to survive. Cho moved through the room, shooting those who were already injured, making sure none could escape. Goddard was hit during the attack, a bullet shattering his leg. He managed to whisper to the dispatcher that he'd been shot before his phone slipped from his hand, skidding across the floor and landing near Emily Haas. The dispatcher tried to communicate with the students, but the line remained mostly silent. Haas picked up the phone and quietly informed the dispatcher that the shooter had left the room. There was a brief sense of relief, but Cho wasn't finished. He soon returned for a second round, firing at those who remained conscious. Haas kept her voice low, fearing that the gunman might come back for her, but the sound of more gunfire soon drowned out her words. The 911 call continued to record as the minutes stretched on. The dispatcher asked for the police's location, urging them to hurry as the shooting carried on. It wasn't until nearly 8 minutes into the call that the police finally arrived. They blasted through the chains Cho had placed on the doors of Norris Hall using a shotgun. But before they could enter room 211, Cho returned again for a third time. More shots were heard over the line, followed by a sudden, deafening silence. The dispatcher, unaware of what had just happened, had unknowingly heard the final gunshot. Cho had turned his gun on himself and shot one final time. A minute passed. All that could be heard was the sound of laboured breathing, though it was unclear whether it was Haas or someone else in the room. The dispatcher informed her that the police were on the second floor and instructed her to open the door for them. Another student, Clay Viland, who had not been shot, stepped forward to move the bodies and desks blocking the entrance so the police could finally enter. It had been almost 10 minutes since the 911 call was placed. A male voice shouted, "Shooter down." The line disconnected once the dispatcher confirmed that the police had secured the room. In just 2 attacks, Seung Hui Cho took 32 lives, 27 students and 5 faculty members, before turning the gun on himself. Among the victims, 28 were shot in the head. 17 more people were wounded by gunfire, and 6 others were injured after jumping out of second-story windows to escape. Cho fired 174 rounds between his 2 handguns, and the ammunition he chose, 9mm hollow-point bullets, was designed to cause maximum damage. The trauma director at the hospital later confirmed that the type of bullets used made the injuries far more severe. The 911 call from room 211 captured every death that occurred inside. It was never released to the public. When parts of the call were covered during a news broadcast in June 2007, none of the actual audio was played. The recording was deemed far too graphic for public release, and those involved in the attack have remained reluctant to discuss it. Colin Goddard, the student who made the call, has refused to listen to it since. Emily Haas, who took over the call after Goddard was shot, won't talk about the details. One of the responding officers later described the 911 recording as one of the most gruesome things she had ever heard. In late 2022, a Redditor submitted a Freedom of Information Act request on the recording to the Virginia State Police. This request, however, was denied, but there was no mention of the recording no longer existing. It's possible that this piece of lost media will never be released. And perhaps it should never be.